This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you everybody for joining us today, and it's my great delight. Oh, do we need to press play? It's on. It's recording the conversation.
Edit.
It's my great delight to introduce to you Henrice Altink, who is Senior Lecturer in Modern History at the University of York. Henrice has worked extensively on representations of Jamaican slave women and has recently completed a book on the construction of ideologies of womanhood in post-emancipation Jamaica called Destined for a Life of Servitude, Defining African Jamaican Womanhood for 1865 to 1938, and it's published by Manchester University Press. She is currently working on the methods by which a class-colour hierarchy was sustained in the British Caribbean from emancipation to independence, and the title of her paper today is War and the Female Franchise in Jamaica.
Thanks. So this paper comes out of the book that was mentioned, Destined for a Life of Service, and that looked at African Jamaican women and the kind of messages that they were given about their place and roles as women. And the last chapter in that book focused on citizenship, the extent to which they were full and equal citizens, and what they themselves and others were doing in order to get them full and equal citizenship. And part of that chapter then really focused in particular on the franchise, but that very much related to the First World War, whereas this paper extends it and looks also what role the Second World War played in the franchise. So, starting with Arthur Marwick in 1974, historians often invoke the Representation of the People Act that was passed here in the UK in 1918 as evidence that war acts as an engine of social change. They argue that this act, which allowed women over 30 who met the property qualifications to both vote and stand for election. And these historians argue that this was passed in recognition of women's wartime work, but what we need to remember is that that particular act from 1918 followed 80 years of campaigning by women, and that it took another 10 years till 1928 before all women over 21 were allowed to vote and stand for election. In other words, before the vote was an equal vote. Now, in this paper, I want to show that the granting of the vote to women in Jamaica was also linked to women's wartime work, but contrary to here in the UK, it didn't follow years of campaigning by women. Furthermore, the vote that Jamaican women received in 1919 was even more unequal that was granted to British women in 1918. So Jamaican women not only had to be older than men to vote, but they also had to meet a much higher property qualification, and more importantly, they could not stand for election. Now, they gained the right to stand for election at the local level, at the level of the parochial boards in 1930, but it wasn't really until 1944 before they gained the vote on the same terms as men. That is, all women over 21 were allowed to vote and stand in both general and local elections. Now, I want to show here that that achievement in 1944 followed several years of campaigning by black middle-class women, but that it eventually really came about as a result of a process for a new constitution that had started in the aftermath of labour riots that plagued the island in 1938 and was speeded up by the Second World War. What might be useful before I actually start to think about how women got the vote in 1919 is to briefly talk you through the system that was, the politics system that was in place in Jamaica at the time, and we refer to that as Crown Colony government. And that practically consisted of a governor who was presiding over a legislative council. The legislative council was made up of 14 elected members, and then 14 official and nominated members. And that's a kind of a strange category. Official meant, for example, the Director of Medical Services, the Attorney General. Nominated were simply people from the local wide elite who were nominated by the governor. Elected members, even though there was a very high property qualification in order to stand for election, £150 from property or £300 from business in order to stand, by the late 1930s, a lot of African Jamaican men were able to meet that qualification and could put themselves forward for election. So by the late 1930s, we actually have a majority of black men amongst those 14. And here you can, well, this is a very bad picture, but on the left are the officials that are nominated, and on the right are the elected. And if you especially look towards the bottom, you can see that there's many African Jamaicans, but even some of the people that you might think are white are actually African Jamaican because they're very light-skinned. So that is the Legislative Council. The Privy Council was a kind of an advisory body to the governor. The governor had to consult them, but he didn't have to take that advice. On the Privy Council were nominated members, there were official members, but there were no elected members. And that already highlights quite an important point, is that these 14 elected members had very little power. They could not put any monetary proposals forward, so anything that had any impact on general revenue, like building a school or a hospital, they could not propose any of that. If the government proposed something like building a school, they had the right to say no, but if 9 of them voted against, that would be overruled. But then the governor had such powers that he could always overrule their veto. So effectively, they're very powerless, these elected members, and that's quite important to keep in mind. At the local level, when you talk about government at the local level, and that's where Jamaican women got the right to stand in 1930, they were made up, headed by a custos, and a custos is a strange word for practically a white man appointed, nominated for life in fact, to head this particular parish, and he was a white man, either born in the island or an expat. It also contained the elected member of the Legislative Council for that parish, and then 1915 other elected members. And again, by the 1930s, these are predominantly black elected members. Parochial boards had to do a lot of different things. They had to provide things like poor relief, roads, offer water, gas, those kind of things. And to offer those services, they could levy taxes, but they were very closely scrutinized by the kind of central government, because they had to give money to the kind of central government, but they also received money from it. So they were always quite closely scrutinized. Now, contrary to Britain, the campaign for female suffrage in Jamaica was not started by women, but by men, and in particular by this man, Herbert J. de Lisser, who was the editor of the Gleaner, and that was the biggest newspaper in Jamaica at the time. In September 1916, when it seemed certain that British women would soon be enfranchised, de Lisser addressed the question of female suffrage in one of his editorials. As laws in Jamaica tended to follow those in the mother country, he argued that within the next 5 years, a proposal for female suffrage would be made. He was keen, however, to ensure that the enfranchisement of women would not just, as he said, give us a number of new voters, but it would be the means to improve the quality of the voting element in this country. Now, what he meant by that is that in 1908, the voters' law had given the vote to men over 21 who paid at least 10 shillings in taxes. Now, these so-called 10-shilling voters were, according to de Lisser, illiterate, and thereby did much to lower the tone of politics. De Lisser stressed the need to ensure that when women were given the vote, it should be at such terms that they would, quote, give us a worthy and intelligent addition to our voters' lists. So practically what he wanted is for only upper and middle class women to be given the vote. Because de Lisser feared that following the enfranchisement of British women, Jamaican women would follow the example of the suffragettes and make far-reaching demand regarding the terms of the franchise, he decided to take the lead himself in the campaign for female suffrage. In May 1918, he began to publish excerpts from British papers highlighting the wartime work of women, hoping that that would then encourage Jamaican women to claim the vote on the basis of their wartime contributions. And like women in Britain, women in Jamaica did quite a lot of wartime work. White elite women, such as wives of ministers and colonial officials, they formed organizations that did things like knitting garments, raising funds, encouraging men to enlist. But also many Jamaican women, including many black women, actually took over jobs from men who had enlisted. And elsewhere, I've written about one of these women, a woman called Layla James, who got a job. She was the first woman who won a university scholarship. And when she came back during the war, after she completed her studies here in London, she got a job in the education department as a sub-examiner. not surprisingly, as soon as the war was over, she was told practically to pack up and go. Now, when Jamaican women did not respond to the editorials that the Lister wrote, he then, by August 1918, made direct calls upon Jamaican women to demand the vote. And he said that they could do that because they had done their wartime work, and also he said that they are taxpayers. So he made a very old argument, namely no taxation without representation. In response to the Lister's editorials then, Nellie Latree, a locally born white woman who was active in a lot of welfare organizations, wrote in a letter to this paper asking for the leader of women to come forward. Now, the Lister really criticized the letter, not just because one of the black politicians, the elected politicians, Hall Simpson, had announced that he would move to include women in the voters' law, but also because he feared that Latree's call would radicalize Jamaican women and that they would demand an equal franchise, so that, quote, there would be an army of women voters who would almost swamp the votes of the men and who will be of the type intellectually and educationally that was designated the 10-shilling voter. Now, the Lister's editorials and also this announcement by this politician that he would move to amend the voters' law triggered a huge debate, and at the same time led this woman, Nellie Latree, and other white elite women to form a committee. In September 1918, that committee submitted a petition to the governor demanding the vote because the present war has shown that the women of this island are amongst His Majesty's most loyal and devoted subjects. And they also invoked the Lister's argument that they were taxpayers and well educated, so that they really could be trusted with the vote. This committee of women also organized various public meetings throughout the island until May 1919. And that is when a bill was passed that then granted the vote to women over 25 who earned £50 a year or paid £2 in taxes. And what is quite important, as I said earlier, this was very much an unequal vote. Jamaican men had to be only 21 and only pay 10 shillings in taxes, and they could also stand in election. So under these very limited terms, only 3,000 women, and Jamaica at the time had a population of about 860,000, qualified for the vote. So very limited. Now, here is a set of arguments that was made in this debate in 1918-1919 about the female franchise. Most of the people who participated in this island-wide debate were white and upper middle class. The almost exclusively male opponents of the vote, and that included also a few black politicians in fact, they argued that the standard of politics would be lowered if women were granted political rights because they lacked intelligence, and some also argued that granting women political rights would violate the laws of God because God had told women, men shall rule over thee. But the argument that these opponents most often invoked was that political rights would interfere with women's duties as wives and mothers. Or as the black politician D. Theo Wind argued, the women of Jamaica have too much worries at home to worry over which person should sit in a council where they are of little use. But while opponents of the votes believed that women were naturally inferior and therefore had to occupy different spheres and carry out different roles than men, the supporters of the vote saw the sexes as complementary. They argued that as voters, women could encourage male candidates to address welfare issues that had been largely ignored by male politicians, such as child welfare, and that as politicians they could help their male colleagues to solve such issues more effectively because of their experience with them on a smaller scale in their home and their special qualities. But they also invoked women's sameness, not just their difference. They stressed that women deserved the vote because they were as intelligent as men, and they exercised similar duties as enfranchised male citizens, like paying taxes. While male supporters of the vote, such as the Lister, portrayed Jamaican women as patriotic citizens by highlighting their wartime work, the female supporters of the vote, who were all white, did so by stressing the selfless work that they undertook on behalf of their community, the country, and also, very importantly, the empire. Female supporters of the vote differed even more from their male counterparts with regards to the terms of the vote. Most women wanted the vote on the same terms as men. Most male supporters of the vote, however, agreed with the Lister that there should be a higher property qualification for women than men, and what is really interesting, I find, is that in spite of that condemning rhetoric about these, they didn't want 10 shilling voters, more 10 shilling voters, none of the elected members of the Legislative Council who supported this motion to include women in the voters' law proposed that at the same time this voters' law should be amended and generally increase the property qualification. So really what we see is that it wasn't just class, but also very much gender anxieties that underpinned the male demands for an unequal vote. But it's not to say that female supporters of the vote were not concerned on their privileged position in society based on their class and race. They firmly opposed universal suffrage. One woman wrote to the Gleaner, for instance, that she didn't think that every woman is as fitted to have the vote any more than any man is. So the women then, who were very much, who were at the forefront of this campaign for female suffrage in Jamaica, they envisioned a restricted franchise, mainly for the likes of themselves, middle and upper class minority women. And they were, as I mentioned, mostly white and either very, very light skinned. Because in Jamaica at this point in time, class and colour were really very closely but very complexly and intertwined, and I'm trying to kind of very basically put it on there. So by May 1919 then, some 3,000 Jamaican women qualified for the vote, yet many, and also some men, were not happy with the terms of this franchise. So soon thereafter then, a campaign was started to bring the age and the property qualifications of women's vote in line with men's, and also to allow women to contest the elections. This campaign, as I said earlier, lasted until 1944, when a new constitution was adopted. By the late 1930s, black middle-class women had begun to play a very important role in this campaign. They made demands for equal votes in speeches that they gave at meetings of women's clubs, social welfare and other organizations, many of which were white-led, but also some that they themselves had actually founded, like the Jamaica Women's Liberal Club. This Jamaica Women's Liberal Club was set up in 1936 by amongst others, these three women, and their names I will mention more often. The first woman on the left is Mary Morris Knipp, an educator. Second is Amy Bailey, another teacher. And then finally is Una Marson, who some of you may know. She was a poet, a playwright, and later also a broadcaster. And what I want to do then in the rest of the paper is first look at the demands that were made in the 20s and 30s to lower the age and the property qualifications, and set out how women got the right to stand in local elections in 1930, and then finally examine how they gained the vote on equal terms with men in 1944. Now, demands to lower the age and property qualifications in the 20s and 30s were mostly made by women, and they were supported with these claims of sameness. They were as intelligent as men, for instance. Until 1938, most men opposed the equalisation of the vote, but many men were not against the enlargement of the female electorate per se, especially not black politicians. In 1937, for instance, A.B. Lowe put forward the motion to grant women the vote at the same age as men, 21, and also to lower the property qualifications to £1 in taxes. Now, other politicians supported that, and some even suggested lower property qualifications, but that they stopped short black politicians from demanding full equalisation was because by upholding some degree of gender inequality, the men of their class and their colour would feel as less of second-class citizens. That Jamaican women gained the right to contest local elections was again the result of efforts undertaken by men. This time, Alfred Nash, a black elected member of the Legislative Council. He first demanded it in 1922, again in 1927, and finally in 1930 he was successful. The members of the Legislative Council who opposed his three motions, including several black politicians, did so largely because they believed that once women got the right to stand for local elections, then their right to contest general elections could no longer be withheld. Now, the right to sit on the Legislative Council posed a major threat to the privileged position of men in society, because it could, of course, then be used to demand lots of things, or opposing lots of things that would affect their position. Now, like opponents of female suffrage in 1918, many of those who were against this, they argued that allowing women the right to stand for election would undermine their duties as wives and mothers. So one white elected member, Da Costa, for instance, said, women should not be at a polling station opposing a male candidate, but they should look after their children and the household duties. Now, I want to stress that Nash and his supporters equally conceptualize women's citizenship in terms of their identity as wives and mothers. They argue that because of their domestic and motherly experiences, women were well equipped to help these parochial boards to solve such issues as sanitation. And they also pointed out because of the more caring nature, women had a stronger sense of sympathy, justice, and that would do much to raise the tone of politics. That Nash and his supporters single out the least prestigious areas of local politics for women, like sanitation, clearly suggests that they wanted to ensure that granting women that right to stand for local elections would not drastically upset men's status. In fact, Nash put forward his motions because he hoped to avoid that women themselves would organise to demand the right and to stand not just for election at the local level, but also at the national level. Now, his fear that women might embark on a campaign was not unfounded, because many Jamaican women did not like the idea to proceed stepwise to gain the right to sit on the Legislative Council. So, for example, the white-led Women's Social Service Club asked Nash to, at the same time, include in his motion the right for women to sit on the Legislative Council. And Una Maser, for example, was convinced that there was a much greater need for women to sit on the Legislative Council than on parochial boards. And the main argument that women used to support their demand to contest local and general elections was that they were able to do a great service to Jamaica as both real and potential wives and mothers. Eulalie Domingo, who was a concert pianist but also the wife of a fervent nationalist, W.A. Domingo, she mentioned in 1937 that while men had skipped the ship Jamaica, it had been foundering and foundering, but that if women became elected members of the Legislative Council and they used their homemaking skills and childcare experience to solve welfare issues, then the ship would head direct from home. Now, to keep the ship on course and more generally to raise the tone of politics in the island, women like Domingo, Amy Bailey, and so on, they deemed it essential that female elected members of the Legislative Council shouldn't imitate their male colleagues, but they should hold on to their feminine skills and abilities. Now, I'm not sure to what extent people are aware of the history of Jamaica. Probably you don't know much about it, but one of the big kind of watershed moments in Jamaican history are the 1938 riots. And what happened is that on the 29th of April that year, a riot broke out on a big sugar estate in the western part of the island, and then it quickly spread to other plantations, but also to lots of other sectors of the economy. And the riots lasted till about the 8th of June. Now, these riots are a watershed in Jamaican history because they sped up the process for independence. It put the island really on the road to independence. And for our purposes, they also did much to speed up the process for the equalization of the vote, and did that in three ways. First of all, it led to the establishment of the West India Royal Commission chaired by Lord Moyni. And this commission had to assess the reasons behind the riots in Jamaica, but also some of the riots that had occurred in other parts of the region. They had spread like a kind of a wildfire. And they had to make recommendations to prevent further disturbances. The commission visited Jamaica in November and December 1938, and they interviewed lots of individuals, groups, also received many memoranda. And its report wasn't released until after the war because of fear that it might actually play into the hands of the enemy because of the conditions it described, really horrible conditions. But a list of recommendations was published and sent to the governors of the islands in 1940. And one of the recommendations made was that local committees should be set up in the island to consider universal suffrage that would assure substantial equality as between the sexes. The riots also led to a lot of criticism about this system of crown colony government. And at the time when this commission was still doing the interviews and so on, elected members of the Legislative Council sent a memorandum to the Secretary of State demanding that the people of Jamaica be given a greater share in the administration of the island. And the Secretary of State responded by asking them to provide a full statement of their views on the existing constitution. And then finally, the riots gave rise to a party political system. Until then, all these elected members they were all independents. There was no political party at all. So in these riots, there were two very important people. On the left, Alexander Bustamante, on the right, Norman Manley. Norman Manley, trained barrister, he set up the People's National Party in September 1938, and one of the first and foremost demands made by the party was universal suffrage. His cousin, Alexander Bustamante on the left, he set up a political party in 1943 called the Jamaica Labour Party, a bit of a misnomer because it's much more like a conservative party. And these were the two parties that were the main parties in the 1944 elections under universal suffrage. Now, as this PMP became really popular very soon, these 14 elected members of the Legislative Council, they began to embrace this idea of universal suffrage. In December 1938, this guy, Jack Smith, another well-known black barrister, he successfully moved that the voters' list be amended so as to provide for universal suffrage. The motion did not specify whether universal suffrage should be granted immediately or gradually, nor did it list any conditions like age. Some elected members, like A.B. Lowe, read this motion as one that would give women the same rights as men to vote and be elected, and they fully endorsed that. But most of the elected members who voted in favour of his motion simply did so because they feared losing support at the polls, and they also expressed the desire that if universal suffrage be adopted, it should be done gradually and with a literacy qualification. So we still have this fear about these illiterate voters. Also, outside of the Legislative Council, there were very many people who disliked the idea of universal suffrage. Now, shortly after the motion of the elected members for a greater share in the administration was sent to the Secretary of State for approval, the governor appointed a committee led by Jack Smith to draft a new constitution so that the Secretary of State would have his full statement of the views of the elected members on the constitution. Now, the so-called Smith Constitution proposed a bicameral legislature with an elected and a nominated chamber and an executive committee that will liaise between the two. It did not include universal suffrage because it said that franchise was not part of the constitution and could be amended outside of it by the Secretary of State. Now, the PMP was quite against this constitution because it provided for representative rather than responsible government. And those are kind of confusing terms. Responsible government meant a system with like ministries, so that elected officials actually had quite a say and a degree of power. Representative government was simply making sure that government, the makeup of government, reflected a bit more the population at large. They also lamented the fact that this constitution did not specifically provide for universal suffrage. The governor and also the Secretary of State were of the opinion that the franchise and the constitution could not be decoupled. In March 1941, the Secretary of State, and by this time it was actually Lloyd Moyney, the guy who had led this commission, he proposed a constitution that was in line with the commission's proposals and that provided for universal suffrage, stating specifically that women would have the same eligibility for voting and membership as men. But according to Lloyd Moyney, if there was universal suffrage and also an end to property qualifications to stand in general elections, what would happen would be an influx of inexperienced and uneducated legislators. Now, to counteract that risk, his constitution provided for a unicameral legislature and only with an enlarged representative element, and it also firmly ensured that the governor held on to his very much his reserved powers. Although Governor Richard strongly urged the elected members of to accept his Moyney Constitution, as it was called, they unanimously voted against it in August 1941, and they proposed a bicameral legislature with an executive committee. A month later, Richard suggested various options to the Secretary of State to get out of that deadlock, and that one that was also proposed by DeLissa, the editor of the Gleaner, namely to propose discussion about a new constitution until the war had ended. Richard strongly opposed that idea because he feared that agitation will grow worse, and he thought it was much better to settle it before post-war problems actually would come upon us. Now, it might be good here to briefly pause and think about what was happening in the Caribbean in the Second World War. Now, the region was far more affected by the Second World War than by the First World War. First of all, it led to what is called a destroyers for bases deal between the UK and the US. There was a U-boat war going on in the region, and that affected the routes of oil, bauxite, food, not just from the US to the Caribbean, but also from the Caribbean to the UK as well. And so what was decided is that in return for 50 old warships, the US would be given 99-year leases for several military bases all the way from Bermuda to Trinidad. And these bases, they were set up very quickly, provided work for quite a lot of local men and women that paid a lot better than their normal local work. In addition, a deal was reached between the US and the UK that allowed for men from the Caribbean to go and work on farms in the US. And this is kind of an agreement set in place then, but actually it's still in place at the moment, where Caribbean men do go out and work on farms in the US. A bit like the Bracero system that some of you may know with the exchange with Mexico. But the US not only became a physical presence in the region, it also began to exert pressure on the UK government to reform its colonies and really wanted to see universal suffrage to be adopted. And the pressure was also particularly felt in this a new organization that was set up called the Anglo-American Caribbean Commission, set up in 1942. In this commission, the US and the UK promised that they would work together on issues that would affect both of their Caribbean possessions. And the US at this moment in time had Puerto Rico and also the US Virgin Islands. And they had similar issues, these possessions, issues to do with labor organization, with health, with housing, and so on. Also, in the Second World War, a lot of Caribbean men enlisted, and in this war, far more than the First World War, black men, after barriers to black enlistment were removed because they were initially still in place. And also, in the Second World War, efforts were really made to implement these proposals from this West India Royal Commission, including many proposals to actually undertake social and economic development work, like road building, school building, hospital building, and so on. But what also meant what happened in the Second World War is the imposition of virtual executive autocracy. Various people were interned, including Alexander Bustamante, who you've seen earlier on. He was interned from 1939 till 1942 on the grounds of incitement to riot. And a lot of other people, including specifically people who were seen to be communists. So there's quite a few of them interned. But in spite of his wide range of powers, the Governor Richards, he did a lot to facilitate further discussion about the Constitution. And as a result, in the summer of 1942, the PMP and a lot of other organizations sent a joint memorandum to the Secretary of State that accepted his views on universal suffrage, but reiterated their demands for bicameral legislature. Not only that joint attack on the mining constitution, but also the conditions in the island suggested that there could be a repetition of these riots from 1938. The PMP, for example, had by that time, by 1942, declared itself a socialist party. And there was also far more increasing pressure from America to institute constitutional reforms. And all of this helps to explain then why in February 1943, the Secretary of State finally agreed to a legislature based on universal suffrage, but with an elected lower chamber and a nominated higher chamber. And the Secretary of State specifically stated that women would have the same rights as men to be elected onto the lower chamber and be nominated to the higher one. Now, it took until October 1944 before all the provisions of that new constitution were worked out. But what it did then in the end is that it provided for a constitution that had a Privy Council dealing mainly with matters of defense, a nominated Legislative Council, the upper chamber, an elected House of Representatives, and then as well an Executive Council responsible for determining policy and introducing legislation. So a bit like a ministry system, but very embryonic. Now, alongside that constitutional process that I've sketched at quite length here, Jamaica women continued their campaign for equal political rights, and that was spearheaded by this organization called the Jamaica Women's Liberal Club. The Women Liberals Club was then made up of mainly educated middle-class black women. As I mentioned, set up in 1936, its aim was to advance the status of Jamaican women socially and politically. It carried out social welfare work in the Kingston slums, but it also did such things as organizing dances, and it ran evening classes in domestic science. It liaised itself with the People's National Party in October 1938, and shortly thereafter began to work to secure the registration of all women who met the voting qualification. Now, a lot, not just women, but also men who were entitled to vote, never registered to vote. And part of the reason is simply because, as I mentioned earlier, the people that they could vote in, elected members of the Legislative Council, they had very little power. So they thought, it's quite futile. Why vote for somebody who's got hardly any power to change my fate at all? And also, a lot of these elected members, when they were elected and were in the Legislative Council, they often did the bidding of particular constituent groups, so quite often the economically elite. In August 1938, Amy Bailey, one of these executive women of the Women's Liberal Club, went to Britain to raise funds and to secure contacts for the very activities that this organisation was involved in. Now, one of the contacts she secured, and some of you may have heard of her, was Edith Martin. She had been actively involved in the fight for the female franchise here in Britain. She'd been elected onto the Middlesex County Council in 1919, but she was also the director of the Birth Control International Information Centre in London. And it was particularly in her role as a birth control advocate that she came to spend several months in Jamaica in 1938-39. She not only gave various speeches on birth control, but also helped Amy Bailey and others to launch a campaign for birth control and to secure support for this initiative from the local wide elite. Martin was also the keynote speaker at the very first women's conference organized by the Women's Liberal Club in February 1939. In her paper, she summarized how women in Britain had received the vote, and she told Jamaican women that they should not be outside of politics because there were so many problems for which they could bring their particular expertise, like housing conditions, the rights of children. But she stressed, however, that the vote was a means to an end, and that end was equality of status and opportunities. She also furthermore encouraged Jamaican women to take a more active interest in politics, whether they were enfranchised or not, by joining citizens' associations, and these were organizations that were in place in most towns in the island by that point in time. Martin's paper was followed by sessions on women as jurists and justices, women in the civil service, vocational schools for girls, and lots of others. And each of the sessions drew up a set of resolutions that in March 1939 were forwarded to the governor. And here is just a list of some of these resolutions, but what you really see is that the first one on that list is suffrage on equal terms with men and women's right to sit on the Legislative Council. The Women's Conference also resolved to endorse Mary Morris Knibb as the candidate for the by-election of the Kingston and St Andrew Corporation. That was an amalgamated parochial board that took place in March 1939. So she was the very first woman to contest the election in Jamaica. That it took nearly 9 years between the time when women got the right to contest local elections to the first woman actually contesting it is not surprising if you consider the qualifications needed to stand at the local level. Paying rates and taxes of at least £6 a year, having an annual income of £150 a year, or owning house or land with a minimum value of £225 a year. Now, Morris Knibb ran a very successful prep school, one that still exists, is still very prevalent, and kind of an elite school almost in the island. And so she was able to meet that qualification. In her campaign, she stressed that she would work particularly on issues concerning women, like the formation of a domestic training centre for girls. That she overwhelmingly won the election was attributed by the lister to the fact that she was actively involved in many organisations. And for, when I was writing my book, I tried to keep a tab on all the organisations she was involved in, and there are too many to list, but included such things as the Anti-Tuberculosis League, the Jamaican Union of Teachers, and so on. The listener actually welcomed Mary Morris Knipp's election, and he used it to endorse women's right to have a seat on the Legislative Council. So by 1939 then, he clearly had changed his opinion about women's political rights. Because of the war, the Women's Liberal Club did not organise a women's conference in 1940, and in 1941 the Women's Conference took place just after the Moynihan Constitution had been announced. While many women thought that this constitution didn't go far enough, especially those candidates that were closely aligned with the PMP, they did welcome the Secretary of State's insistence that any new constitution should include universal suffrage. When the Secretary of State agreed in 1943 to this bicameral legislature, the Women's Liberal Club not only began to organise civic groups to prepare women for the exercise of the vote, but also reiterated its demand to allow women to become magistrates, justices of the peace, and all sorts of other demands to ensure equality of status and opportunities. In April 1943, the black elected member of the Legislative Council, Erasmus Campbell, he asked in the Legislative Council for a Sex Disqualification Removal Act with, quote, a view to assimilating the civil rights of women with their political rights. In an interview with the Gleaner that he gave shortly after this act was unanimously passed, Erasmus Campbell completely ignored the groundwork that had been laid for that important act by the Women's Liberal Club. So according to Campbell, in the general joy about universal suffrage, nobody thought of moving this more important legislation without which the women could not exert many of the rights which they hoped to exert under the new constitution. Least of all, the women of this country thought of making the necessary legislation, though one should have expected that at least some of the many women's organizations would have thought of it. The first election for this new House of Representatives was held in December 1944. 4 out of the 130 candidates contesting that election were women. Mary Morris Knipp was amongst it. In addition, Iris Collins, Marion Bovell, and Edith Dalton James. What these 4 women had in common was the expertise of local government and or their participation in this Women's Liberal Club. Although Morris Knipp was the first woman elected to political office in Jamaica and had played an instrumental role in the joint memorandum of the PMP in 1942 that had paved the way for the new constitution, she overwhelmingly lost the election, largely because she stood as an independent. And by this time, 1944, the pendulum had really swung towards party politics. Now, the only woman of the 4 who was elected was Iris Collins, and she's the second on the left at the bottom. And she was a member of the Jamaica Labour Party. Now, even today, female politicians form a minority in Jamaica. Although the island has a female prime minister, Portia Simpson Miller, only 13% of all its MPs are women. And in some of the other parts of the Anglophone Caribbean, it's even worse than 13%. Now, as way of conclusion then, the title of this paper, War in the Female Franchise, is clearly somewhat of a misnomer. The 2 world wars were not the driving force behind the process by which Jamaican women gained political rights. In fact, it's more appropriate to say that they were the backdrop of that particular process. The work that women did in the First World War was mobilized by supporters of women's vote in 1918-19, and the pressure that the US put on Britain to grant constitutional reforms in return for wartime support was one of the reasons why the Colonial Office did not propose a new constitution based on universal suffrage until after the war, but they did during the war. Now, I've tried to show here that the process by which Jamaican women gained equal political rights was from the start actually tied up with questions about not only changing gender relations, but also shifting class and race relations. And although it was men who took the lead in the enfranchisement of Jamaican women and in giving them the right to stand, I've tried to demonstrate that women, both white and black, were not passive recipients of equal political rights. Especially black middle-class women in the 1930s did much to achieve this aim by encouraging women to register for the vote and by organizing civic classes. Yet it can be argued that the arguments that they used in support of their demand for equal political rights, women as real and potential wives and mothers, upheld dominant ideas of femininity, in particular the idea of women as dependents of men, and that thereby they actually constrained women's possibilities as citizens. And I'll leave it there.
explicitly about what you think the impact of race was in this. I got a stronger sense in the paper of gender, perhaps, than I did of race. And I guess I'm thinking about two particular parameters. One is ideology, the extent to which race was explicit in ideology, either for opponents or proponents of female suffrage. The other is maybe thinking globally in terms of the different ways in which responsible government comes within the British Empire. Was what happened in Jamaica more like what happened in India, for example, where race clearly was also very salient? Or was it actually quite like what happened in Australia or Canada? And how does that maybe help us think about race as well?
I mean, it's a really complicated issue, and you know, I'm currently writing a monograph that, you know, addresses race head on. And the complicated thing in the Caribbean, the Anglophone Caribbean, is indeed that race and class are closely entwined. But at this moment in time, you're talking about a population of which less than 2%, probably less than 1% in some part of the later part of the period is white. All the others are, most of them are of African descent. A very small proportion is of Indian or Chinese descent. So that is the racial makeup of the island at that point in time. But the way race worked is that white superiority in any ways. So the whole way, the whole system of crown colony government, which was really presented as a kind of a trusteeship, we get these people up to a stage where they can be safely granted independence. This is a kind of a training ground. You know, we have these elected elements so people learn how politics work, etc. But it was always done in such a way that the interest of the white interest, the white elite's interest was upheld. What is also the case at this point in time is that race is what I call, in my forthcoming book, is a public secret. Everybody knows that race plays a huge role in when it comes to such things as the allocation of university scholarships, when it comes to the allocation of jobs. If you're white or if you're very light-skinned, you're more likely to get this. But nobody really dared to speak about this openly. And those who did so were usually openly vilified. So people like Marcus Garvey, for example, that people might know, you know, that was not seen as polite. You know, that's not the kind of thing that polite society doesn't talk about that. But there are, you know, when you look at the debates, the undercurrents are there. When a lot of black politicians demand a lowering of the age of, you know, for women or property qualifications, at the same time they also make a statement about, you know, we are no longer happy and satisfied to be treated as second-class citizens on account of our race. But then, of course, because that long trajectory in which race had played out meant that, and patriarchy coming in there again, that means that these black politicians do want to uphold some sort of a difference there. But it is, and then the process by which the vote is gained is indeed, you know, if you compare it, or the constitutional process is very different from India, where there is much more kind of a local resistance, where colonialism gets overthrown. In Jamaica, you get independence in 1962 as you know, years of more, you know, fiddling around with the constitution a bit here and there. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that when these colonies were settled, when they first became British colonies, in India you talk about the 19th century effectively. In the Caribbean you talk about the 17th, early 17th century, and it is happening at the same time as the African slave trade. So it's a very different process where the people I talked about, like Norman Manley, who plays a very crucial role in eventual getting independence, these are people who are steeped in European norms and values. They've come up through a secondary school system that was like British public schools. He then, for example, became a Rhodes Scholar, went to Oxford, and when they then demand independence, they can only conceive of it, for example, in the Westminster model. And the whole idea of violence to get independence is completely doesn't come into their mind at all. So it's a very, very different way of doing things, and race, I think the longer trajectory is quite more important there.
It's really intriguing by what you said about arguments that they rely so heavily on women as reimagined wives and mothers and other possibilities. But there any examples of other women or men trying to find other discourses, or they really silenced was it?
Yeah.
And do you think that maybe some of them just just use these arguments for convenience.
Of course.
And just,
you know, when you think of it, I mean, even, you know, there's lots of people writing for other countries and contexts, and you have this maternal sentimentalism that feeds in lots of debates in the 20s and 30s, whether you look at the US, whether you look at the UK. When women are making demands, they realize that this is one card that they can use. It's a safe trope to use rather than very more radical demands at all. Yeah.
Questions? I shall exercise chairs.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions for you. I wonder if you could say a little bit more perhaps about the way in which the different racial groups of women's organisations interacted or didn't interact. So you spoke very well about the way in which middle-class black women spearheaded the progress and process towards suffrage. What about working-class black women, and what about the relationship between black middle-class women and their white counterparts? Was there an overlap? Did they come together on any issues? Or were they quite separate and distinct?
So again, that's very much in the book, in the last chapter of the book. But practically speaking, black working class women did not have organisations. And again, you come back to education, but simply having the time to organise and do these things. There were black working class women who joined trade unions, of which there were quite a few by the late 1930s. Dressmakers, unions, those kind of things. But again, we're talking more about, if you talk about working classes, it's the more the upper working class, let's say. With regards to the organisations, you had indeed a lot of women's organisations initially in let's say, the interwar years. They were mainly headed by white elite women, often the wife of the governor, wife of the colonial secretary. They were all doing these things, and there were a variety of them. Social purity organisations, and you name it, that was there. Black women did join them as members, but when it came to executive positions, it was impossible for them to get through it because of the ways in which elections, let's say, and the way these issues were dealt with and how women got onto the executive boards practically made it impossible for black women to get on. Because they, for example, would need to be recommended by 2 executive members there who were all white. So so there was quite a social gap in that regard. And the black women then set up their own women's liberal club, partly because they can't make any headway in these existing organisations, but also partly because they feel that these are not tackling the issues that concern the majority of the women in the island. And in fact, things come to some extent to a head over an organisation called the Child Welfare Organisation. Child Welfare Organisation, similar to the Child Savings League, it's kind of they had them everywhere in all colonies, they were affiliated to the Child Savings Leagues in the UK and so on. And that was set up in Jamaica, the Child Welfare Organisation, by a white elite woman. And then Mary Morris Knibb, the woman who was elected, the first woman elected to political office in Jamaica, she wanted to get on, she wanted something, and they were told, well, if you women want to join us, then you've got to form an auxiliary of our organisation. And to do that, you then have to pay a particular membership fee to become an auxiliary, and that was quite steep. So that is when a lot of black women then thought, well, if they don't want us, we will set up our own organisation and we will do our own welfare work, because child welfare association doesn't go into the slums, doesn't know where the majority of the poor women who have lots of babies and who struggle to feed them and to do all sorts of things. We have to do it ourselves. So there is definitely a lot of friction, and some of it which is actually played out in the papers and even before the West India Royal Commission as well, where Mary Morris Knibb testifies and she says, look, there is clear discrimination in these organisations. They don't want us in.
Because, I'm just sort of thinking that it seems that's a common pattern, isn't it, with women's movements?
Yep.
Is this, particularly when there's sort of, there's different classes, there's different races involved, there's this struggle actually to be unified on issues that actually are common to women. But always sort of the race and class is the is what causes the friction and sort of rather hampers their goals. If nobody else has another question, am I permitted a second? Similar sort of lines, but thinking more in terms of, again, sort of broad, I'm sort of thinking more broadly, this isn't my particular area of research, but think about women's movements, United States, India, South Africa. One of the commonalities, one of the factors they share in common is that the fact they reached out to each other, they learned from each other. I was very struck by Edith Martin and that connection that she comes over and actively, very explicitly says, this is what happened in the UK and this is what you need to be doing, almost providing a sort of verbal manual to how to go about getting suffrage. Are there more examples? To what extent really then did the educated middle class black women, the upper class white women, to what extent did they look outwards? Did they look to examples and models in other countries, from other sort of, did they correspond? Did they seek support externally, politically, and so on?
So a lot of the white-led women's organisations were actually affiliated to similar ones in here. So they would correspond and there might be visits. So that is definitely there. There's far less what you would perhaps assume, far less with the US, even though there's lots of visits from Americans to Jamaica, or even people like Du Bois and so on, they visit Jamaica. But there's far less to do there specifically with women. But it's also interesting, you use the word women's movement, because in a way what we have is not a women's movement, because they are not joined together. And so there might be individuals corresponding with individuals elsewhere. And again, Amy Bailey was clearly involved in that, and she corresponded to lots of others, especially on this issue of birth control. And Una Marso, for example, again, she has corresponded with lots of people, and there's an autobiography about Una Marso who sets out some of these things. But a lot of the women as well. The problem is we don't have writings by them. Except for what they wrote in terms of articles and public speeches that were, summarized in the paper, we don't really have their personal papers. From Marston, we have some things. Amy Bailey, only stuff to do with birth control, really. Mary Morris Knipp, no personal papers. And in the project that I'm doing at the moment, I'm struggling, trying to find anything about any kind of black politician, for example. Practically impossible. There's no archives where you can find personal papers of any of these people. So you can't really trace any kind of correspondence. But I think as well, a lot of the women, even the women who are members of the black, the Women's Liberal Club, they were working women as well. Again, so it comes back to an issue of time. Do they have time to correspond and liaise and travel and meet? A lot of the white elite women, because they were wives of colonial officials, would always spend time in Britain, a couple of months every year or every other year. So then they could catch up and get a sense of what was going on there. But they were much more conservative in terms of their demands and their worldviews, etc.
Do you think if they had been more unified, if there had been such a thing as a women's movement, that actually there would be a greater success story to tell? There would be...
It's a very much a what if, but a very impossible if. Let's put it that way. Because they were so fragmented, as the whole issue of class and race is such that it would have been practically impossible in that regard.
Did he point to this at all? Did he vent his frustrations at this? Did anybody sort of outside of it all say, well, come on, you need to...
Well, I mean, his was very much a self-interest reason why he did it. But he did highlight the fact that there were organisations as such, that each one working on a specific issue, whether that was social purity, whether it was tuberculosis, whether it was this, whether it was that. So very separate. Yeah.
Were there any moments where there was a women's movement in Jamaica, either before this movement or after?
After. Yeah. I mean, in the aftermath of the war, a lot more of these proposals from the Moynihan Commission get incorporated, and there are some attempts to get together white and black women to do such a thing as mass wedding campaigns to get women to marry, because there was a very low marriage rate in Jamaica with as a result, a high illegitimacy rate. So there was an initial moment after the war, but it's not really until the 1980s that that women's movement really comes off. And it's partly, from 1972 till 1980, there was a PMP government, but it was democratic socialism, with a lot more emphasis on equality, and that had a very active women's group. So a lot of things, for example, to allow children born outside of wedlock to get the same legal status in terms of inheritance and so on, was partly advocated by that movement. And again, in other parts of the Caribbean, it's not really until the 1980s that really makes a huge difference there.
And did they look backwards at all? And what had been
some of it. You do have, our heroes. In fact, Jamaica's got 7 national heroes, one of whom is a woman. She led a slave rebellion, a maroon woman called Nanny. But yeah, there is some looking back, and especially when some of the women I talked about today, like Mary Morris Knipp or Amy Bailey, when they died, and you look then at what's being written about in the paper, then you do see them as being claimed as some sort of the leaders of that movement.
It's pioneers.
Yeah.
I've got a question. You talk about in the 1980s, that's when the formalised women's movement started. But isn't there anything before that? Because obviously there wouldn't be archived documents to prove that actually women were working together to try.
I mean, there are definitely, I'm not saying there are no women's groups, there are lots of women's groups, but actually much more coordinated effort, and an effort that puts a lot of pressure on the government to actually change women's position. You don't really see that until the 1970s under the Manley government. But definitely there are things going on. One of the important things that, and it's been written about, is the Sistren Collective, which was a theatre group where local working class women were sharing their experiences about being women. And some of the women that were involved in it have written things, and they're published, and you can find, what is it like to be a woman in, 60s, 70s in Jamaica through that collective. And that's been quite important, that Sistren Collective. It still exists, but that did a lot, especially to bring more working class, middle class women together as well.
You're speaking about this is emerging from the most recent book project that you're working on. What was the thing about it that you found most striking, that you found that you didn't expect to find?
In the book about African Jamaican women. What was the most interesting one? Difficult one? Well, the book, it has several chapters, but some deal more with marriage, motherhood. And one of the things that was particularly interesting as well is how women negotiated these different demands that, the different messages that they were given. They were given messages by, on the one hand, the media, like the Lissa and others. They were given messages by the teachers in their schools. And at the same time, they were given messages by their mothers, their neighbours, their sisters, and they were very conflicting at times. And how they negotiated that, and how particular practices remain very much, especially in the working class communities, where people, in spite of the numerous messages about, you should get married, you should have your children after you get married, and so on, they were maybe not ignored, but reworked. And that kind of, that is very fascinating. Because especially in the literature, there's always an emphasis, a kind of a heroic emphasis on the working class Jamaicans and in other parts of the Caribbean, resisting this kind of white middle class norms and values. But actually, there is no wholesale resistance, even if they held on to what one could call more folk practices and so on. It was often amended in such a way that there was an engagement with white middle class norms and values about things like marriage, about sexuality and so on. So it's that negotiating, that kind of field of messages. And as well as, the constraints, even if they had wanted to live up to white middle class norms about femininity that were mentioned in the paper or in on you know, in the churches and what have you, their conditions were such that they could never ever live up to it. So it's real poverty. You know, by the late 1930s, a lot of mothers refuse to send their children to school. It's not that they don't want them to go to school. In fact, they highly value education, but they can't afford to dress their children. They can't afford to give them food to take to school. So rather than, you know, letting their children go to school in rags, they don't send them to school. So, I mean, that's the case by the late 1930s, and that explains very much these riots that went on. Sheer poverty. If you look at, you know, there were nutritional surveys done in different parts of the empire, but also in Jamaica, and you look at nutritional values of what people consume, what they eat, how deficient it is in all the major nutrients. It's really striking.
And did that story play back to Britain at all?
Yes.
Right.
I mean, that's why this report of the Moynihan Commission, it was withheld because they thought, well, if all of these conditions that all of these people were talking about in these public, a lot of them were public submissions to the commission, if Germany finds out about this is, you know, going to play into their hands, because it was really showing that this whole notion of trusteeship had been a farce. It you know, never existed in practice. It was exploitation, to put it bluntly. And so horrible conditions were mentioned in that report. So that's why it was postponed until 1945. And that in turn had a huge impact on the whole empire, in the sense that it gave rise to the Colonial Development and Welfare Act of 1940 that set aside a large amount of money for development projects in the whole of the empire. Because there was this notion, like, you know, we've been neglecting and something needs to be done, as well as, you know, sheer propaganda. If you want to uphold the empire, you know, you have to prevent it from outside of attacks like the US, so you better do something about all of that.
And did the US play a role in that at all? You were mentioning earlier about that, the pressure.
Yes. I mean, there's definitely pressure going on with, you know, Roosevelt's points and what have you. You know, all of that has a huge impact.
All connects.
Yeah.
Questions?
I can throw one.
Okay.
So you mentioned about the dynamic that exists between Britain and the United States and Jamaica, and how that sort of creates a very sort of almost kind of forward momentum sort of impact. Was there any sort of negative tension that existed because of replacement of those bases, particularly with regard to the Jamaican community who may work on those bases? So were there sort of relationships that were damaging and harmful that were struck out? And I'm thinking a similar context would be, say, the way American GIs were regarded in Australia. Was there any of that sort of antagonism that existed? And did that sort of work counter to the sort of the more sort of philanthropic ideas that America had towards sort of improving the colonial performance of Britain? How did that relate?
So, in the war, then, they have the US gets these 99-year leashes on military bases. In Jamaica as well, you have then US soldiers being based. And, you know, there are definitely racial frictions. Not as much as there were in Trinidad. Trinidad had a very large US army basis. And at one point then, the US Army, because of pressure, stopped sending black GIs to Trinidad. And there was a lot of friction as well, with black GIs competing with local black men over black women, as well as lots of other things where the white soldiers, the white American soldiers didn't want to work with the black GIs. So in the end then that becomes a real contentious issue in Trinidad, and there's been some recent work done on that. But also at the same time, what it did in Trinidad is, and there's not that much work done on Jamaica, but it might play out the same way in Jamaica, is that in Trinidad, the local population suddenly saw white people in a very different light. When they saw these, you know, let's say, the white soldiers, the white American soldiers being very horrible to the local population, far worse than any of the local whites were, they start to no longer uphold white people. They no longer have them on a pedestal. So it actually may, at least that's the argument in one of the recent books about Trinidad in the Second World War. They actually say, well, actually it's done, to some extent, it has helped the local population to think about race in a different light. So that's,
So tensions aren't sort of limited to the base.
Yeah, it goes out. yeah. Okay.
Any other questions?
I think Elise need to thank you very much.
Thank you for having me and asking some very important questions.